Welcome to Africa Express. We are at the United Nations, at the Assembly of States Parties 10th section at the UN. I have with me today a group of Africans from different African countries to discuss various issues that are going on right now within the region. One of my first questions is, we've been having a lot of post-crisis when it comes to election in Africa. What can Africa do as a region to minimize this post-crisis after election?
The problems that we have in Africa are deficits of capacity to enforce election results. Incumbents are only willing to respect election results in which they win. So those who oppose them have a lack of means to enforce results in which the incumbents have lost. We've got to then think of how to ensure that all electoral outcomes are enforced, including those in which the incumbents are lost. To enforce those, we will need to look at the capacity of independent institutions, whether judiciaries, police or militaries that support incumbents, to tell those incumbents you have lost, step forward.
Now let's move back a little bit and talk about transparency of elections in Africa. Transparency, fairness, compliance with the law and the provisions of the Electoral Act. When you look at these situations, generally in most of our countries, I'm from Nigeria, one of the major issues is the issue of transparency, the issue of credibility in elections. People come up with, I'm not accepting because elections have been rigged. I'm not accepting because this happened and that happened. So what do we do to ensure that in Africa, elections are credible, elections are fair? This is another critical issue, because most of the time you find people using the power of incumbency to ensure that they win elections at all costs. So at the end of the day, you find that the losers will not accept. So we have a lot of issues to talk about around the issue of post-election violence. Why?
Many times when we look at the issue of elections, there is a temptation to focus more at the post-election period. But it's important to reflect on different phases of that process, right from the pre-election, during, and then the post-election phase. Many times the seed already for trouble is already cast at the level of setting the legislative framework, because that's where you define the framework that is going to govern the law. And if it's already faulted from the very beginning and there is no consensus around the legal framework that is going to govern election, therein lies already the seed for violence. And again, institutions that are going to supervise or manage elections, like for example the Electoral Commission, if it's not a consensual commission that is already agreed to by the different political parties, already then from the very beginning the different political parties are contesting the impartiality of the Electoral Commission. And then the other challenge in Africa sometimes relates to the police as an institution. Rather than having, say, a democratic, responsive police that respects human rights, we have a police that is into regime policing, and therefore interprets its mandate as protecting the regime rather than protecting ensuring human security, respect of human rights. And when it comes to bungled up results, stolen votes, sometimes, especially if that has been done by the regime, then the police interprets its obligations as protecting the regime instead of assisting those that have been defrauded of the vote, and that leads to violence, because then institutions that would have protected, would have ensured order, themselves contested the institutions.
The other question is, AU, we've seen the African Union not cooperating with ICC in terms of al-Bashir and Gaddafi. Do you think our leaders are sending the wrong message to the world that we are above the law?
Talking about the African Union, I wouldn't say that the AU is sending the wrong message to the rest of the world. When you look deeply into the concerns being expressed by the AU, you'll find that it's not misplaced. The whole of the situation, or rather cases that ICC is considering, is in Africa. But one thing that maybe we have not considered is how did those cases come to be before the ICC? In the first place, if you look at Uganda, Uganda was referred by the Ugandan government itself. Cote d'Ivoire was referred by the Ivorian government itself. DRC was referred to the ICC by the government itself. It is only in the case of Kenya that the prosecutor used its initiative in line with the Rome Statute. It is again in the case of Darfur and the case of Libya that the Security Council waded in. So now you find that out of 6 or 7 cases, 4 were referred to the ICC by the African government, which means that Africa, the message Africa was sending to the world was, it is no longer business as usual. Africa is against impunity. Africa is against injustice. Africa wants to bring to justice whoever is responsible for crimes against humanity, and so on and so forth. So I think that the message that the issue of all these cases coming from Africa, the message is sending to the world is that Africa wants to start on a clean plate, that Africa does not want impunity anymore. For the AU to call on African states parties not to cooperate with the ICC, I think that it's actually a misplaced, it's not sending the wrong message, but it's bringing Africa to show Africa as standing against the victims of these crimes of very serious nature. Africa standing on the side of impunity, and this is not in line with the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which implores the African Union to ensure removal of impunity in Africa. So I think that the message is that the non-cooperation is sending is that there's something wrong which we have to look inwards to begin to correct, because it is inconsistent with the message that Africa was sending initially by sending those cases before the ICC and by supporting the establishment of the ICC in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to know that actually Africa has not been against the court from the very beginning. Indeed, the Rome Statute came into force largely through also the contribution of Africa. As you know, our 30 states already did ratify, and that is a significant contribution as a single bloc contributes the Rome system. It is also important that already in its legal framework, the AU has made a commitment to end impunity. Where then do we see trouble? The trouble struck when an indictment was made against the city. That's where the trouble is. So again, it's important that we understand and appreciate that the Rome Statute does not recognize immunity. So whoever bears the greatest responsibility for crimes against humanity, for crimes, for genocide, is personally liable for those offenses. And therefore, the response that we see from some states is, in my opinion, also a self-preservation kind of stance, although riding on genuine concerns, like, for example, my colleague has indicated, that there are concerns that perhaps maybe the court should should expand this operation to take in stride other regions as well. So we can see a connection between the indictment of the sitting head of the government and the backlash against the court. There is an intricate relation there that we should not decide.
Yeah, I just want to elaborate a little bit on what my friend Mohammed had just said with respect to the AU stance against the ICC. I mean, there is a gap between what happened practically with the African State Party and the AU as an organ. You have the African State Party who voiced their support to the ICC during a meeting such as this, but then the AU as an organ will just say that they did not approve the way the things are going on. So these guys need to be filled, and the best way to address it is to go maybe talk directly to the regional organs such as SADC and ECOWAS to find a way to fill the gap and to make sure that the AU as a whole could talk with only one voice, because it's clear from the Constitutional Act that the AU is against impunity, and to fight against impunity, the only credible and the sustainable court we have for the moment is the ICC. So the AU needs to be more concrete and more practical while addressing the issue of cooperation with the party.
Also that the principle of cooperation is mandatory within the Rome Statute system. When we say that 30 states, African states, ratified the Rome Statute, so they should also know that cooperation with the ICC is a mandatory. It's not a question of the will or not, it's a mandatory. So when you ratify a treaty, you should know the consequences also of that ratification. Secondly, I would like also to add that regarding the will of African states to cooperate but also accept this case of the arrest warrant against the President of Bashir, we should notice that there is some of influence from the state who are not state party to the Rome Statute to the state who are already party to the Rome Statute. But also there is also a gap between African experts on the ICC or Rome Statute system and the head of state of African states. So this gap need to be restricted, and then we can see maybe in the future head of state complying with all the provision of the Rome Statute regarding the cooperation.
How much do you think that politics plays? How much role do you think politics plays in terms of judicial reform in Africa as a whole?
I mean, when you talk about politics, about judicial reform in Africa, you could not address efficiently the issue without taking into account the political landscape in which you are moving in. And it's unfortunate that we could not, our leaders could not try to implement a sustainable judicial reform that could lead the African continent, the African leader to respect the rule of law and to abide to democracy. Just because anytime you want to address this issue, you are in a position to take into account the position of the incumbent president, the incumbent political leaders, and those who are in opposition does not feel themselves concerned. So at the end of the process, you will have to restart the whole reform again. For instance, if you take the judicial reform in respect of the ICC in the Democratic Republic of Congo, you realize that this reform should be ended long time ago if it was the government, the incumbent president who has taken the initiative to introduce the law reform before the parliament. but they were not doing so for almost 5 years, and this initiative came from the MPs. So now the government can see this initiative coming from the MP as a kind of offense to the government. In this situation, we don't witness good cooperation between the government and the opposition, and for sure the outcome of this kind of reform is just a mess, because either you lead the reform to the success and then the government will not enact it, or they will just block the process. This is actually the situation, for instance, in the DRC, where at the end of the process of the end of the mandate of President Kabila, we did not see any ICC bill, which is very, very important, for instance, for the DRC to exercise its primary jurisdiction over the crime under Rome Statute. But so far, we did not have any law in this country, so which is very, very difficult to explain.
Any addition?
Yeah, example, in some countries, in sub-Saharan regions, in one end, the government is requesting an assistant or technical assistant in order to reform its judicial body in terms of equipment, in terms of training, in terms of sometimes founding some project in the judicial system. But in the other hand, when for example the international community is asking the government to really deeply implement reform on the judicial, for example, to emphasize the independence of the judicial body, it's difficult for the government to implement that. And they have also one power is that they are making the judicial body system unfounded. What means that you can see judge or magistrate are not well paid in most of sub-Saharan African countries. Why? Because they want to make them dependent on the executive power.
Yeah, just to buttress what you said about independence. In most of African countries, you find that the judiciary, although there's a separation of powers, where the executive is supposed to be independent of the legislature and then the judiciary and so on. But you find that the legislature might have financial independence, whereby its own funds are coming directly from the consolidated fund, but for the judiciary, it's either coming from the executive directly, so that it's according to it's related to its good behavior. If the government is not if the judiciary is not pro-government, then the funds are tightened. If it is pro-government, then you find it's properly.
So they cannot act independently.
Yes. So if a judiciary is not financially independent, it will never be independent. Judicial activities. Yes, politics, as you said.
Some of the African countries are not signatory to the Rome Statute. My question is, are there anything, any law, can they be held accountable for human rights violation under international law?
Yeah. We'll start with the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute leaves an open window for Security Council to refer a case to the ICC. You see, because the ICC principally has mandate over only the state parties. The prosecutor, for instance, cannot on its own open up investigation in a country that is not a party to the Rome Statute. But luckily, there's a provision in the Rome Statute that leaves a window where the Security Council can refer a case, whether that situation is a state party or not. In the case of Libya, Libya is a state party to the ICC. In the case of Darfur, they're not a party to the ICC. But the Security Council was able to use the provision of the Rome Statute to pass a resolution to refer that case to the ICC. And that is why. So it is one open window where a state that is not a state party to the ICC can be held responsible for serious crimes, irrespective of the fact that it's not a state party.
Which then makes it very important that members of the Security Council need to identify and support the ROM system, because it's an important trigger mechanism that is available for states that are outside the ROM system, those that have not ratified. And where we have some states that have not, it weakens the system morally. And it's very important that those states that are part of the Security Council that have not ratified or asked to do so to strengthen the system.
Yeah, I just want to add the fact that this situation becomes very critical when you assist to a situation when a country who is not a member of is not a state party be voting for a resolution that refers the situation to the ICC when this country is not also a state party. For instance, the US or China or the Russia, they are not state party, but they can influence, they can use their power, their economical and military power to refer the case to the ICC. And that's made very critical the situation to handle, and that's why this window opened by the Rome Statute, which is very indispensable, because from the preamble is clearly stated that the crimes under the Rome Statutes will not remain unpunished. But for that to happen, we need to find a way to hold accountable those who are not yet state party. That's why where the Security Council enter into the games, but with this handicap that you can have states who are not state party to the ICC using their power at the Security Council, and they refer the situation to the ICC.
One last question. Do you think that the ICC applies the same standard when it comes to prosecution of African leaders?
Well, to be honest with you, so far, one wouldn't say that the standards are, that they're not applying, ICC is not applying the same standards. But I don't know if I'm mistaken, if I understand you to mean ICC not applying the same standard across board, you know, in the cases that they take on.
Yes.
Okay, if that's what you mean, that is what the concerns of the African Union is principally, that there is a problem in the way the standards are applied. That how come it's only in Africa that if there's any semblance of a commission of a serious crime, ICC goes immediately. But there are other instances around the world which were named the same name, that ICC was expected to intervene and they have not. So maybe you should take another tactic. But this is why the African Union is feeling the way they are feeling. That there are other cases where at least the ICC ought to have opened the investigation or preliminary examination, and they have not done it. Whether it is
at least under the prosecutor's own volition or under UN Security Council, because even under UN Security Council, in both instances, these are on the African continent, and the question is, there are instances elsewhere that would merit that kind of intervention.
Syria was mentioned.
Whereas African states have made some self-referrals, those are understandable. What about the other instances that would have, for example, attracted attention? There lies the bone of contention with regard to how the court is selected.
So it's actually expected that with the new leadership in the ICC, that things will change. I think that if Africa sees that ICC has moved into other countries, I mean, it will be a different ballgame. But for it to remain within Africa, and there are cases that are actually crying for ICC intervention, and it has not intervened, you know, it kind of enforces and reinforces this conception within Africa.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to sit down and share your views with us. We really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoy the rest of the week if you're staying. And again, Thank you so much. You have been watching Africa Express, and thank you for staying with us on this segment. And please do continue to watch this channel, same time and same place.